super exciting to have you do an interview for the DARGchive. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to be part of the DARGchive, given I only have a peripheral relationship with DARG, but I feel very pleased. So I feel very pleased to be there.
We're very happy you accepted. So we're here with Eric Laurier, reader in Geography and Interaction at the Institute of Geography and the Lived Environment within the University of Edinburgh. Thank you very much, and I'm just going to fire off the first question and ask you how you became interested in conversation analysis and ethnomethodology.
I became interested in conversation analysis and ethnomethodology, the mouthful, through, I suppose the seed was in some ways sown by one of my supervisors who was a Goffman guy, amongst other things, who's interested in many things, saying, oh, I don't think you want to get involved with that kind of ethnomethodology thing. It's just about people doing kung fu or fitting tires to trucks. And I don't know what it's about. Mm-hmm. And I registered this at the time and thought, okay, that sounds quite intriguing. But in the end, still was reading things like Goffman and other sort of allied approaches, which had that sort of, nevertheless, sort of performative, close to CA ethnomethodology approach, but wasn't that aware of it. So I think it was lying there in the background of my mind. And then I was reading a lot of work in science studies, because that, I guess, when I was doing my PhD, there were a lot of people interested in what was happening there. It was a sort of intellectually exciting community. So you had people like Bruno Latour in that domain, and Mike Lynch. And so I was reading Mike Lynch without really fully realizing what ethnomethodology was, and then ended up reading Scientific Practice and Ordinary Interaction. And so that's, I guess, a particular way in, the Mike Lynch way in, and thought that was really, really interesting, and solved a series of problems for me that I'd had about science studies, and I thought, okay, that's pretty fascinating. Partly because I had already been interested in ordinary language philosophy as well, but not ever really fully seen the connection to social science yet. Just sort of thought, okay, this is interesting, what's the connection? So that made that connection for me. But in parallel, the weird thing was then in parallel, I was also on a project for the first time where I had something like, 150 interviews to do. And so was churning through these interviews and was having to do these sort of mechanical coding exercises where I had to find chunks of conversation and add some sort of tag to them that they were on some particular topic. And was very uneasy about the sense that some of those quotes, which were notionally given the same tag by topic, were actually emerging out of very different conversational contexts. And so somehow the sense of them at the time was being removed in the sort of cut out and paste exercise. So I was looking for other approaches that somehow would preserve the context of the talk at the time, and read, I think it was an Elliot Mishler book, which is about interviewing, which then touched on this sort of conversation analysis approach and Harvey Sachs. And so then that name rang a bell, given that it was also appearing in this other reading I was doing at the same time with the Mike Lynch book. And then thought, okay, I'm going to find out who this Harvey Sachs guy is. And so I can't remember if I I doubt I found the lectures immediately, but I found various things about him and conversation analysis and read more of that. And so then had this sort of twin way in, where I was reading sort of ethnomethodological work on one side, and then starting to read this conversation analysis work on the other. So that's sort of how I arrived, was basically through two doors at the same time. So I think that was the first connection, really. And I guess unlike other people have stories of I was supervised by. But that's not the way I came in. I sort of came in just through reading, and which I think leaves you with particular gaps in your skills and knowledge, but nevertheless is one way in.
Yeah, that's basically my next question. How did you then develop your skills and your unique way of doing ethnomethodology and CA?
It was really hard to do that sort of work by yourself, and I guess it's very familiar for people who were at DARG, of course, but it's very much a collective enterprise. So it was definitely something of a struggle, and I wasn't sure what I was doing. And what really helped was when I was at the University of Glasgow, Barry Brown also started there about the same sort of time that I did, and we said, well, let's get together and try and do what we think they're doing in these data sessions. And we had some familiarity with through people like John Hinmarsh with what they were doing in terms of their video analysis, even though I don't know if Barry had ever been along to one of those, but we had this sort of idea in our head anyway, of, well, they're going to sit down around a video clip, which is what we've been doing individually already, and try and make sense of it. So we got a small group of us together at Glasgow, and we basically spend our time looking at video clips and trying to do justice, you know, in light of our readings, trying to do justice to what we were seeing there. And we basically had a sort of Harvey Sachs-like rules of his for getting ourselves started, where Harvey Sachs has that nice section where he says the talk of kings and queens or important historical figures is in its way interesting simply because it's significant people saying these things, and that gives it its import. Whereas the point of conversation analysis, if you take any piece of talk, no matter how seemingly trivial or mundane, the baby cried, the mummy picked it up type, and find what's of interest in it. So that became a sort of ethos for us, was to choose clips that often seemed very dull, and the test was to see if we could produce something interesting as a kind of noticing or finding or whatever out of them. So I mean, that was as much of a sort of approach as we had, and we were very unrigorous and lax in our transcription. We were working within video recorded material most of the time. So most of the time we were sort of using video as our source, and not sometimes not transcribing at all, but simply constantly staying with the video.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, it was. It was good.
And how did conversation analysis and ethnomethodology kind of inform your research, and how did you start incorporating those methods when in your research interests, in your projects?
That's a good question. I think it was sort of gradual, because it was a gradual working out which is, I suppose, a thing which we go over a little bit in conversation analysis and ethnomethodology, the sort of craft of how do you collect material in that way, and how do you present it, and how do you... So that was sort of a gradual learning process, where when I look back on ways in which material was collected or presented, it was full of problems. But those were problems that you learned from in terms of just things like who was holding the camera, what the camera was focused on, how long the clips ran for, and then how you got the visual material out of that, in what sort of formats you transcribed things. So that was a very sort of gradual accumulation of how do I actually put this into a final published paper. And because I'm in human geography, and I guess particularly cultural geography, then it was also working out, well, how do I introduce this approach even to this discipline, which had minimal historical involvement with ethnomethodology when it was significant, unlike, say, something like sociology. So it didn't really have any existing relationship with it, which is beneficial in some senses, since obviously sociology and ethnomethodology have had a very tense relationship with one another. So part of it at the beginning was simply working out how to sort of justify and introduce this work to an audience that's not familiar with it, and a readership that's not familiar with it. So and that of course made sense to me, because I was also trying to work out for myself how is it that it responds to and relates to existing work. And a lot of that existing work at that time, and it continues to be to some extent in particularly cultural geography, is very theoretical work. As a discipline, it went from being very quantitative, positivistic, and data-driven, and almost as a sort of swing to the opposite extreme. A lot of the work now is very theoretical, quite abstract. It does have always has an empirical component. So the sort of empirical qualities, or empirically guided conceptual work that ethnomethodology and conversation analysis does sits very nicely as a response to that often quite sort of high theory approach. So it's also, that was part of working out what it was for in terms of my own background, where I'd had a lot of education in post-structural theory and stuff like that. So
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the projects you've done in the past, the ones you've particularly enjoyed and you remember fondly. I know you've done lots and lots, so it's probably hard to think of all of them, but just a couple of details about.
Yeah. I was actually talking about this last night, and so that it was a useful primer for today. It is genuinely hard to choose, because of course it doesn't really necessarily divide up in a project by project way what is sort of been interesting or enjoyable. That said, the last sort of large project that I did, that was a large funded project, was one on film production, particularly editing practices. And the project shifted from working with people who are basically just working in their houses, sort of doing, or on the kitchen table, in fact, editing together video of sort of home movies, or one of the guys I worked with who was really interesting was a sort of rock climbing, mountaineering, yacht sailing, kind of all action adventure kind of guy, and made all these sort of extreme sports types videos and others, but they're all very artfully made. So it had that nice component which you get in a lot of social science research of being in different people's homes and seeing a little bit about their lives, and that was done through the work of editing, in that you're both in the home but then also seeing them editing something that relates to that space and to those the people and those practices. But the nice thing about the project was that we wanted to take a slice across editing in lots of different situations. So it went from this quite domestic setting to then working with a community centre where they were teaching, in a very deprived area of Edinburgh, where they were teaching mostly young people how to make films about their community and about their lives, but also make sort of fiction films. So there you had it as part of community work, and that was really fascinating, then being immersed in that sort of community, getting to know the people that were involved, that were trying to make this enterprise work. And then shifting again to BAFTA award-winning editor who basically operates within the industry at an industry level, and it is an immensely talented editor. So seeing what that was like was just fascinating. And in amongst that also spending time in sports production, which is a much more sort of assembly line, factory-like production of edited clips. So it was just a project that really took me into all kinds of settings and situations. And so in terms of the sort of fun of doing a project, because often a project will take you regularly into one situation, like you're doing medical interaction, so you're in a hospital, in a particular department, a lot, and you get to know the people, and that is rewarding in its own way. Whereas in this one, it really took me to all sorts of situations. So it was a particularly enjoyable project. Plus, in it, picking up basic video editing skills was also quite useful. So that was part of trying to understand what they were doing, particularly in the professional side, where otherwise you just don't know. They're working so fast, you don't really have a clue what they're doing, unless you do a little bit of training in video editing as well. So, life skill picked up during project as well.
Yeah, that's a really good thing. That's really fascinating. Can you talk a bit about the projects that you are currently working on, whether they're projects that you're working on your own or collaboratively, maybe with your PhD students? So what are you interested in at the moment?
So the cafe research, which I did over a decade ago, is the research that refuses to die. And despite me making various attempts to kill it off. And so the original project was sort of ethnographic, but with some video recording in it, in cafe environments. Just tapping into that moment when cafes were sort of suddenly appearing everywhere. And then it was like, okay, what? And there's obviously different sorts of practices. There's workplace practices there, but there's also kind of everyday conviviality. But of course, it's also a horrendous place to record in. Cafes are very noisy. There's all kinds of ethical complexities about the privacy of the conversations at particular tables. So the original project, in a sense, the actual real-time video recordings weren't all that great. The sound was very compromised. Even when we had microphones very close to people, the background noise still drowned out a lot of what they were saying. So we actually didn't have that much usable verbal material. That was a useful switch for us, because we then ended up looking at a lot of the visual organisation of the cafes. So, people stand around to pressure people to vacate a table, that sort of thing. the assembly and order queues, sort of more classic kind of things about queuing and things like that. So lots of those sort of visual organization work. And it gained a lot of attention because there's not much research on cafes, in fact, but of course lots of people are interested, and it seems a classic sort of social sciencey kind of topic. So I, at various points in the years later, got asked to write things about it, and would do that. No, that project's finished. Did that quite a while ago. Not really going to do that again. But at the same time, one of the cafes that I'd filmed in, we gave them films of the cafe back as gifts, just kind of short films. And one of the cafes had actually ended up attracting a lot of its customers through the fact this short film was on YouTube, and basically people would see it on YouTube and then come to their cafe. So they were very keen for us to record again for their promotional purposes. So I was like, well, okay. And I was doing the video editing project at that time as well. I thought, well, I can also then use this as an exercise in editing. So I'll make quite a pretty looking film for them for promotional purposes. And at the same time do one that's much less pretty for interactional purposes. So set up again and did some more recordings, but with the lessons around audio that we'd had from the first project. So redid that with audio, just with a recorder on the counter, sort of very close to people, but that had a good side in the sense they knew they were being recorded, but then was picking up the sound because the counter was a bit quieter. And the nature of the conversations there are more public, so less ethically sensitive. So did another set of recordings there and thought, okay, so I've been asked several times to do more papers on this, and that got some fresh recordings. So then it was like, okay, back to cameras. And then very recently, a group of researchers in Finland who are interested in both multi-activity settings, but also settings with mobility and body torque in particular in them. We're saying, where do you think we could collect some more materials? So I said, well, I could probably collect some more cafe material, because I'm also interested in the arrival of contactless as a new form of payment, and that seems to have changed the order of service a bit. So then I went back and did a third set of recordings. And so the nice thing is there's now a set of recordings with reasonably substantial breaks of something like 6 years between each one of the same cafe. Well, the cafe's actually moved. The same people are actually in a bigger premises. So the second two are both in the bigger premises. And so that's become a sort of very interesting set of materials to work with. So there's sort of very long-term projects like that, which is the cafe project. And the other one that's of that similar length and continuation is work that I've done on people travelling in the car. And that was originally a funded project, but another one that's never really gone away. And so we were just doing the original project was funded by the ESRC and was just looking at situations where you had families or workmates together in the car. And then this summer that was sort of continuing in New Guise, where we had some money given to us by Nissan to look at cross-cultural traffic. Wow. Which was much more sort of the outside of the car rather than the inside. So the intra-vehicular interaction rather than the intra-vehicular interaction. So that's one that sort of rolled on and along. Those have been probably the two longest running themes. But then a third main strand has been around work, a lot of it done with Barry Brown as well, which has been, not that we ever really had funding for it, but we keep bumping into stuff around navigation maps. And they cross over an interesting moment in that the first projects, it's all paper and or books, kind of guidebook type maps and things like that. To more recent recordings where it's all smartphones and tablets or computers, but paper's still around to some extent. So it's quite nice because they do run for over that material. I guess it's probably 15 years worth of material. We've just picked it up at odd points when we've sort of seen the opportunity to record something.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. My next question arises from something you said yesterday. During our little introduction section, you mentioned at some point getting an email from Harold Garfinkel, so probably a lot of people in the room at least were wondering what that was about.
Yes, so there are lots of Garfinkel stories, of course, and my Garfinkel story is that I opened up my email one morning and there was one in my inbox that said it was from Harold Garfinkel. And my immediate assumption was that it was, in fact, from Barry Brown, who, with his computing skills, had somehow managed to fake Harold Garfinkel's email address. And indeed, on opening it, it had a slightly peculiar tone. I was thinking, this sounds like someone might be pulling my leg, in that I don't remember the exact wording, although it is pinned to my office wall, it has been for many years. Along the lines of, my wife and I were, I was sitting down reading your paper with such excitement and delight that I had to call my wife through to show her the fantastic, amazing, and presumably several other terms, all with commas between, running into a long list of things that this maps paper, so some of the maps work that Barry and I had been doing. And so how good this was and how delighted he was, and he wanted to get in touch.
Wow.
And so, as I say, from the tone, I just sort of thought, okay, that's quite a nice send-up of Harold Garfinkel. So I then got in touch with Barry Brown to say, I'm not sure how you did this, but that's very good, very funny. And then, of course, he was like, this has nothing to do with me. And so then we read the email together and wondered about, I think briefly, who else might have tried to scam us with a fake Harold Garfinkel email. Before finally then thinking, okay, he has communicated to us, that's interesting, and now what do we do? And of course he has a record of being a very unpredictable character, was a very unpredictable character, so there was a lot of back and forth over what happens if we respond, how should we respond, so we toyed with various possibilities before then producing something quite neutral and polite. Well, thank you very much for your attention, delighted that you liked the paper. And so he corresponded a few times after that. And I think it was, if you look at the very last pieces of his published work, when already he had a habit of not completing papers and working on them endlessly, he was compiling, I think, more recent work that touched upon strands of things that he was interested in. Where if you look at, as I say, some of the last published pieces, you get these sort of lists of references, and we were one amongst those where he was interested in the map work. And so I think it was about making those connections to a sort of very current generation of people who were doing the work, and then folding that back into the current writings. In a way, because it wasn't, I guess he was very old already at that point, so it wasn't like it was going. I think he was keen to meet us at a conference, but then he wasn't able to attend, so we didn't then meet him there. The email remains on the office wall as one of those Garfinkel moments.
Wow, that's very interesting story.
Exactly, where he was nice Garfinkel, not the other Garfinkel.
Yeah. So my final question is about SEDIT, the Scottish Ethnomethodology Discourse, Interaction and Talk Group, which is within the University of Edinburgh and organizes data sessions. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about its history and its composition and how it works and so on to make it more, to sort of spread out the word, basically.
I'd be very happy to, since it's always good to have other people come along. The history of it comes out of the group that I was mentioning earlier, that there was a group of us at Glasgow, Barry Brown, myself, and a couple of other people who would come along, which is a very sort of interdisciplinary group, where we were doing various sorts of things. And then I moved to the University of Edinburgh. And so we kept going between the two universities, and had a reasonably regular influx, mostly of PhD students, but often who had really no background whatsoever in ethnomethodology or conversation analysis. Were maybe using video for some reason, and were trying to make sense of what they could do with video. And that was always quite hard. The population would sort of come and go, and they'd often, which often meant you were basically starting again afresh each time with new students. And then I somehow or another crossed paths with two of Sue Widdicombe's students who were running the group while she was on maternity leave. And so we were like, oh, well, maybe if we put the two of our groups together, we'll have enough to have a sort of regular population of people coming, and so have some constancy. And they were from a more, to some extent, conversation analytic background, but also more sort of discursive psychology. And so then that meant we basically had a sort of larger population of us, more regular meetings. And then when Sue came back, we're then focusing on a lot of interview and identity type material, mixed in with video material. So I guess it has its own particular flavour. As we were discussing, DARG itself has sort of fluctuated between different people, different interests, different topics. And so we've had that with SEDIT as well. And that was probably, I was realising that I hadn't actually ever counted back the years, but I'm assuming it was probably about 7, 8 years ago that it became SEDIT. I may even be slightly longer than that. And that means we have fortnightly meetings, because I know it's DARG weeklies, fortnightly? Weekly.
At the moment.
Yeah, so we're fortnightly. We do sort of hour-and-a-half sessions. We do, having picked up important symbolic things from DARG, we spin a pen to decide who will speak. It's not on a plinth or anything like that, but nevertheless we do spin a pen. And the group now, we've got a fresh bunch of PhD students coming in, so I'm guessing that will mean there are probably about 8 of us going along to the group from sort of different backgrounds. It tends to be a lot of psychology, social psychology students. And apart from the fortnightly meetings, we try and do various workshops, 1 or 2 of those a year, and those have been sort of smaller or larger scale. And if ever we've got someone interesting on campus, like Liz Stoker, for instance, who is passing through Edinburgh reasonably often, but we've also had Jonathan Potter and Alexa Hepburn up before, and various other people. If they're in town, then we'll try and get them along and have a session on whatever day they're there. So, yeah, I mean, it's quite low-key in a way. We've not tried to get central funding for or anything like that, partly also because it's not just University of Edinburgh. We have, so Sally Wiggins was a regular attender. She was the University of Strathclyde. So it's more a sort of Scottish collection. But we're down in Newcastle today, and I've been talking on and off about making connections with Marge, who are the group here, who are Marge, not Marg. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is to try and do more stuff in common with them.
Sounds great.
Given we're only an hour and a half away, do of course have plenty of overlap. So that's the sort of current plan. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to do an interview about that sometime in the future.
The SEDIT Marge merger.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's good.
Cool. Thank you very much for a wonderful interview.
Well, thank you.